Thank you, everyone. We'll start with the opening prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this day. May many more come. We thank you for all the blessings you have bestowed upon us. We ask that you watch over our family and constituents, wherever they may be. And we pray for those that are mourning during this time. We've had a few deaths in our communities that are really feeling the impact. And we just ask that you watch over our communities, Lord. We ask all this in your holy and precious name, Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. So we have two agenda items, a public hearing on Bill 45 and Bill 48. Can I have a mover to accept the agenda? Moved by Mr. Blake. All in favor? Okay, thank you. Any declaration of conflict of interest? Seeing none. Welcome to our meeting of the Standing Committee of Social Development. I'll begin with introducing my colleagues with me.
Thank you. Julie Green, MLA for Yellowknife Center.
Good evening, Frederick Blake. I'm the MLA for Mackenzie Delta. Welcome.
Welcome, Shane Thompson, the Henday. We also have at the back of the room Allison Anderson. This is her first committee trip with us, so welcome. She is our analyst, community analyst, and Jennifer Frankie Smith is our committee clerk, and the gentleman on the audio equipment there is Chris Cartwright. Today, the Standing Committee of Social Development is holding a public meeting hearing on Bill 45, the Corrections Act, and Bill 48, the Post-Secondary Education Act. The Standing Committee on Social Development is a committee of regular members of the Legislative Assembly. The bills we are reviewing today were introduced by the Minister, given first and second reading in the Legislative Assembly, then referred to the Standing Committee for review. Legislation is typically brought forward by Cabinet and is reviewed by Standing Committee. The members of this committee are responsible for holding the government to account, and one of the ways we do this is by making sure that proposed laws are supported by the people in Northwest Territories. It is our responsibility to consult with residents on what they like and don't like about the bills. We would like to hear your views and comments, which will be used by committee to identify any changes we'd like to see made by the draft legislation, and which we will then report back to our colleagues in the Assembly. The Standing Committee is holding public hearings already in Fort Smith, Hay River, Fort Province, and Betchaco. After tonight, we will be going to Tuktoyaktuk, and on May 23rd, we'll be in Yellowknife. We then report back to the Legislative Assembly on the proposed legislation during the upcoming August sitting of the Legislative Assembly. I wish to briefly describe the intent of these bills. Bill 45, the Corrections Act, repeals and replaces the existing act. The new act focuses more on rehabilitation and community integration of offenders. Operational improvements are made in security, monitoring, case management, programming, and staff training. Bill 48, Post-Secondary Act, allows post-secondary education institutions to operate within the Northwest Territories. The Minister must consent to the establishment or operation of a university or college. An act of the Legislative Assembly is also required. The Minister must authorize the granting of a degree or offering of any degree programs, and post-secondary institutions must have Minister approval approval for tuition fees, must regularly evaluate programs, and must submit annual operating and capital budgets. There's a copies of the bill at the side table should you wish to grab them. Please help yourself. If you'd like to share your views with us today, please let the clerk know. They'll be sure to get you on the list. We also accept written submissions by postal mail or email until June 28, 2019 at 5 p.m. One final piece of housekeeping. Please remember that all submissions will be part of official committee records and will be reflected in our final report. Any submissions made during this meeting may also be televised or broadcasted via social media. Thank you, everyone, for your patience in allowing this introduction. With members' agreement, we can now open the floor to comments from the public. Do members agree? Okay, thank you. If when you want to make presentations, just please state your name so we can have it for the record. Yes, both acts. You can focus on one, or you can focus on both. There's a mic right there.
My name's David McMartin. I'm the Director of Intergovernmental Relations with the Gwich'in Tribal Council here in Inuvik. I have a few comments regarding Bill 48 in Part 3. It doesn't take very long to read Part 3, and that's of concern to us. We made a submission to the government during the consultation process a little over a year ago. It was in April of 2018, and we recommended that there be an effort to model the approach to dealing with Indigenous post-secondary institutions based on the legislation that is in place in the province of Ontario. And I must admit that I don't see any evidence of that. So we will be following up on this issue, because it's a very important issue in terms of the long-range nation-building objectives of the Gwich'in Nation as represented by the Gwich'in Tribal Council. And we feel that it's a very important initiative to have this. It's good that it's included within the legislation, but we feel there needs to be more statement of the guiding principles for this and the structure of how and plan of how it will go forward. And a good model is the Ontario legislation that has been described as path-breaking legislation. And the reason being that it's related to a number of factors. One, because of the effect of the residential school experience, there's a disconnect between the youth and the traditional culture that normally would have been passed on. And the post-secondary Indigenous institution can help in dealing with that cultural history and dealing with the challenge of language, passing on and developing the language, the Gwich'in language. And we feel that that needs to be done through an Indigenous institution that may be one of any number of forms in partnership with other nations. Forming an institution potentially could be done in conjunction with some existing institution like Aurora College. But we feel there needs to be more meat on the bones, if you will, of Part 3. So just came here to kind of hear more about it. We've studied the issue and made our submission, but I just want to kind of underscore that point and hear if you've heard anything about this or in your deliberations as a committee, if you've looked at that legislation. If you haven't, we'd commend it to you.
Thank you very much for your question. In the plain language summary for Part 3, it says that regulations will be developed through engagement with Indigenous governments and organizations, which will include criteria that must be met to be recognized. So as a regular member MLA committee, we have no oversight over regulations. And generally our preference is to see the detail in the legislation itself so that we are able to provide oversight on that. But as you've pointed out, the detail is very much lacking. You probably already realized this from the separate engagement process, but this is sort of a overarching piece of legislation to establish institutions of all kinds in the Northwest Territories. If there was a particular institution to be developed, for example, if Tashinta wanted to have recognition, they would have to apply under this act, but they would be granted establishment through a separate act of the Legislative Assembly. So you'll see that in this act, it doesn't say anything about governance. There are a number of notable absences, but the idea is that that would be filled in by specific acts for specific institutions. So this really is just to tell people what would be required if they were going to consider setting up an institution, that these are the minimum conditions that would have to be met. Thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, so is it any potential to send the stuff that you sent to the department moving forward? Because as Ms. Green talked about, we haven't seen any of those things. And again, as you said, Part 3 is very small in nature in the Act. But again, it's about the regulations, and maybe that's where they have this information and they're looking forward to it. But I guess my question is, are you guys able to share that with us?
Certainly will do. I don't have it with me tonight, but I'll take your coordinates and certainly pass that on. One of the things that we suggested for consideration is also having, as the member said, it's a kind of a catch-all legislation that's dealing with a number of things. Ontario's legislation is a specific Indigenous Post-Secondary Institutions Act, and that's what we think is needed at some point. It may be not now, but I'm pleased to hear the members say that the preference of the committee is to have the kind of policy principles and objectives laid out in the legislation, because that way there's some guidance given by the legislature to the minister in the exercise of that regulation-making power. And in the absence of that, as was pointed out, there's a lack of ability to do oversight, which is very necessary. And we would commend that perhaps the legislation should include some principles and have an aspirational element to pursue the assessment and analysis of whether the Ontario model is applicable here in the Northwest Territories. I'm from Ontario, and I did my master's research relating to Treaty 9, so I'm very familiar with the Indigenous peoples in Northern Ontario and studied Treaty 3 as well. And there are a lot of similarities between the regions of Ontario for which that legislation would be most applicable and the situation here in the Northwest Territories. So we think the sooner it's in place, the better, but it has to be part of an overall plan to assist Indigenous nations in the building up of their national identity and cultural heritage and knowledge of that. And the educational institution plays a key role in that. For example, we have a language revitalization specialist that works with us. And one of the problems that he's identified is that there aren't enough people knowledgeable of the Gwich'in language who have the teaching skills. So we have some various initiatives that we're doing that are trying to teach the teachers how to teach Gwich'in and how to teach people with the Gwich'in knowledge who are, let's call, I think he used the term latent. They're not fully fluent, but they're close to it, to kind of move them up to that capacity and then develop some on-the-land type teaching environments that will help enhance the prospects for passing on that language. These institutions can play a key role in developing those missing ingredients for language revitalization. And so we don't think that it needs to be looked at in isolation of nation rebuilding policy. In that connection, we have, as you probably know, together in the Northwest Territories, a very good mechanism of bilateral meetings between the cabinet and our board of directors. And at the last such meeting, we established a joint, we agreed to establish a joint committee to look at what is the nation-to-nation relationship between Canada and the Gwich'in Nation mean for the Northwest Territory. What is the role of the Northwest Territories in that? Well, there's an example right here. It's helping prepare the educational infrastructure that will help in the nation-building effort. So we're at kind of the starting blocks in defining this, but we think your committee and the legislature has an important role in helping ensure that the government takes a more holistic approach in its legislative and policy efforts and not have these things disconnected in terms of issues like language revitalization. That's just one example, and that committee, and we haven't really got into detailed work yet, but we think that process can help move us along, and maybe some aspirational policy principles can be defined in the legislation that can provide guidance to the regulation-making, decision-making process.
So I have a question for you. In other sections of this bill, there's detail about quality assurance, the evaluation of programs, the supply of strategic plans, budgets, and other kinds of administration. And there's quite a bit of overlap from one kind of institution to the other about supplying all of these things. Would it be appropriate in this bill to have that kind of detail for the Indigenous institution?
I think it's perhaps premature. What I think is more important is kind of, if you think of the more of the objectives of what an institution would be, and defining what those are and the policy principles, and our submission addresses that, and the Ontario legislation that we refer to there provides that kind of thing. And we think that if you put that in and inject that in, then the details can be worked out under the umbrella of those principles, and recognizing that these institutions are of strategic importance to the nation building, which is of strategic importance to the territory as a whole. And so we think that if there are some aspirational and principles level statements in the legislation, that would be helpful. And then our concern is that we've seen this on a number of pieces of legislation unrelated to this, where there seems to be a predilection to resort to the regulation-making tool, which not only does it not provide oversight, but it provides an excessive demand for consultation and monitoring and analysis on the Indigenous governments for things that affect them, because this is happening all across the whole swath of legislation that over the last year we've been confronted with having to deal with. And the more that there are opportunities for oversight and opportunities to define what the guiding principles will be, the better. We've made this kind of conceptual point on other pieces of legislation, and it brings that, it brings more into the light what the parameters are that the minister responsible needs to be taking into consideration when making the regulation. And another specific example was in terms of the Mineral Act and the question of industrial benefits, and what would guide the minister in making decisions using the regulatory power pertaining to that. That's just one example where the same issue that I'm raising here came up, and it appears throughout. And so we'd encourage you as legislators to be attentive to that, because we don't think it's healthy. It's healthier to have agreement on the principles and on the objectives, and then have the engagement occur right through and including guiding the minister in the exercise of that discretion, because otherwise we feel that the minister in the absence of guidance, will perhaps make a decision that may be appropriate or may not. But there's no parameters of guidance for the minister. So in this case, it's strategically important for the future, but we need to get the educational infrastructure and the objectives around it laid down now, so that when the time comes to get it into place, maybe have a separate piece of legislation, that it'll be there. That might even be something that can be referred to, that while this legislative train, if you will, I used to work for Canadian Pacific, so oftentimes I think of train. If that train is moving down the track, okay, good, it's enabling, you're doing something, but maybe one of the sidings that needs to be addressed is perhaps recommending the government consider developing an Indigenous Institutions Act, a separate piece of legislation. That could be kind of an outgrowth of this initial effort.
I just have one more question for you. Thank you for those points. So when you talk about the principles and the aspirational statements, would we find those in your submission to the consultation process?
Yes, there will. And then what I'll do is, I know when the planes leave, so before I'll make arrangements to drop it off and give you a copy, and then I can email it to you, and then we can have discussion around it. So it's it was pretty focused, so I think you'll have that information. I'm actually just finishing off a leave, so when I saw you were going to be here, I thought, well, I'll come in and talk, but I don't have the material to share with you today. But otherwise, I'll get it to you shortly, each of you.
Thank you. Oh, she's a staff person.
Okay. This is the first time I've seen...
Your name, please?
Oh, sorry. My name is Crystal Lenny, and I'm here a resident of Inuvik. I'm not here on behalf of any organization. I may say stuff because I'm a beneficiary of the Inuvialuit final agreement, but this is the first time I've seen the information. I am a master's student, taking it by distance, and it took me about 3 years to secure funding for my first year for master's funding. And when I thought, okay, they're going to revise the Post-Secondary Act, that means they're going to release the capping of funding, or else at least open the act where that clause of my Indigenous right to education would be taken out, where there's a cap for students' funding. But that's not the intent of this act, I now recognize, since actually just going through it briefly. But where I can see where my case would fit is through Section 56, through the Access to Information and Privacy Act, where the minister would, Section I, where it says understanding sources and patterns of student finance, where the minister would look into that. And Section L, identifying conditions or barriers that inhibit student participation, progress, and completion and transition. So if you bear with me, I'm still going to bring my case forward because I think it's something that needs to be heard. I'm very excited that the GNWT is looking at developing a form of university within the Northwest Territories. I think that bringing higher education north is very good for the people of the north. I also feel, though, that the teachers that are teaching in schools need to be held accountable. They make $120,000 plus a year, and students need to be able to be brought to that academic level where they can pursue a post-secondary education. And that there shouldn't be students left in the gap or on IEPs or pushed through the system. So the social passing, that needs to be looked at. But that's not part of what I'm going to bring forward. What I'm going to bring forward is in relation to removing the barrier. And the reason I'm bringing it forward is because I did go through the SFA appeal process to go to school in the fall of 2018. My application was denied, so if I didn't get outsourced funding somewhere else, the Inuvik Regional Corporation, I still wouldn't have funding. It would be the 4th year that I wouldn't have master's funding, that I've been trying to seek master's funding. Your Minister of Education, Ministerial Special Advisor, stated to me in an email, stated that I received, and it's personal information, but I'm going to put it there, that I received since 1999 $79,000 in student funding. I didn't graduate from high school. I did go in upgrading, but if you put into perspective the cost of living, the cost of being on income support, that's bare minimum. Over the years since 1999 for funding, I've got a Bachelor of Science now. I've got a diploma in business administration from the Aurora College and a number of certificates. So I think it's money well spent, I think, in my opinion. And going back to where this section would fit, is the territorial government accepts federal funding for the post-secondary student support program, INAC, Indigenous and Northern Affairs, or whatever they're called now, CERNAC, does not administer the program. And for master's students, if I were an Inuit living outside of North of 60, I would receive up to $50,000. According to the program, I would receive for a full-time student approximately $50,000 a year in funding, which is well below the $79,000 that I got the degree and diploma with. But I'm going to read you my statement based on that, because the funding does flow to SFA student financial assistance for post-secondary, and this is where it'd be barriers. And this letter was written, and I've got the wrong date, but my appeal was August 3rd, 2018. And it says, I'm going to highlight a few key points from the documents that I have attached here, and you can have access to the documents when I'm done. Firstly, the program funding that is administered by your Student Financial Assistance Program for the federal government post-secondary student support program. Secondly, a treaty right to education by Sheila Carr-Stewart, in which Ms. Carr-Stewart highlights the following. The treaty educational clauses establish an educational policy, the availability of educational services whenever Indians desire such services, and emphasize the Crown's fiduciary obligation in educational services. And the Supreme Court of Canada, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, recommend the recognition of education as a treaty right. The Royal Commission stated First Nations want 2 things from education: the skills they need to participate fully in the economy. And thirdly, that falls in line with the principles expressed by the Inuvik Final Agreement and recognized by Canada that include enabling Inuvik to participate equally and meaningfully in the economy and society in Canada's north and of the nation. And then fourthly, the Inuvik Final Agreement is one of Canada's modern treaties, sections 4.2 and 4.3 under Citizens' Rights and Programs, where it states the Inuvik shall not be treated less favorably than any other Native groups or Native people with respect to governmental powers or authority conferred upon them. And fifthly, the 2007 report for the Auditor General of Canada, where the House of Commons, Chapter 3, says that we concluded that Indian and Northern Affairs had not met some of its significant obligations in the management of responsibilities for implementing federal obligations related to the Inuvik Final Agreement. And sixthly, where the Northwest Territories entered into devolution. And why you heard all of that is because the Northwest Territories entered into devolution. And you also are accepting federal funding and administrating it for students such as myself. Pertaining to the Constitution of Canada in 2.1, where nothing of this agreement shall be construed so as to affect any manner of the Constitution of Canada pertaining to Aboriginal rights and interests. And this is with devolution, and nothing in this agreement shall be construed so as to abrogate or degrade from the limit or limit to or restrict any fiduciary duty or obligation of the Crown to Aboriginal peoples of Canada. And so the response, I went through the appeal process, and I was a full-time student in the fall. I'm now a part-time student, which then they would have looked at it through the right lens. They didn't, was that my next step would be to take the territorial government to Supreme Court within the Northwest Territories. That is not my intention. I do hope that if you guys are interested in bringing post-secondary education to the north, a barrier would be then the capping of student semesters, because most students that graduate from the Northwest Territory schools need to go for upgrading anyhow, and it needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The obligation of funding and accepting funding from the federal government to administer their programming and not allowing policies that are general or specific to master's level students and just washing the funding, in my opinion, is wrong. And I believe that you can be innovative in what you bring in terms of programming to the north using, and this is separate from all of this, and going back to your intention of that. You can use video conferencing, you can use teleconferencing, you can do cohorts, and you also can do partnerships with educational institutions in the future. So those are my points as a student, and I still will apply for your SFA program. Again, even though I know the response, because I still will be looking for funding in the fall. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal. So I do have one question for you. So when you talk about the $50,000 for that program, the federal government has now given that pot of money to the territorial government
Yes,
to
that's
administer?
correct. Yes, that's correct.
And so are they following the guidelines that the program was developed for, or is it just put in for funding for SFA?
My understanding, and based on the response that I got from SFA, and there isn't any specific policies under the SFA guidelines, is that it's just going for SFA in their programming. And I wouldn't qualify anyways because I've capped my maximum semesters.
Okay, and so you talked about IRC helping you move forward on this. So was this funding that the IRC was able to access from the federal government, or is this something with the beneficiaries are allowed to access?
I believe it was something that they were able to access from the federal government, but my point is not the federal government funding, it's the government of the Northwest Territories accepting federal government funding that is for a specific program, saying that they're going to do the funding and not have policies in place around that funding.
I just have a question of clarification. You said that you appealed the result from ECE. Can you tell us what happened?
The appeal committee said, if you want, I can read it to you. It said, and I don't have the letter in front of me, but I've got the email from the person from EC&E programs. It says, "Good morning, Ms. Lenny. Please find attached a copy of the decision of Student Financial Assistance Appeal Board. In your case, along with a cover letter from the appeals office, as set out in the cover letter, decisions of the board are final, but it is possible to apply to the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories for judicial review of their decisions. The judicial review process does not involve the appeals office, but goes through the NWT Supreme Court."
So thanks for that. Do you recall the reason that I gather the appeal was denied. So what was the rationale for that?
This was my response to them from that initial email, and I said, I quickly glanced at the letter from the appeals board. It looks like they looked at my case as a part-time student, which is not the case. I'm a full-time student with the university. I left out where I'm from. did they want me to consider proceeding to a higher level of appeal when they looked through the long circumstantial lens? And the response was the same. And thank you for your time, but that's the only way I can frame it is through your section 56 to make it applicable. But I think it needs to be heard, and if there's any way that you can work, and I know it's the end of your sessions, but maybe in the future one, to look at getting rid of the cap of student semesters and recognizing the access and barrier is most students in the Northwest Territories aren't graduating at a grade 12, so they do need to take upgrading. The mandate of the current institution needs to move away from upgrading and actually into degree granting.
Yeah, so I can just tell you some from my personal experience of what I've been doing with, I've had the pleasure of going on a tour with the Minister of Education, and a number of the constituents that I represented did bring this concern up about upgrading and the need to be and address that, and how it has an impact on your ability to use SFA. So the minister said she was going to be looking into that. There was some follow-up going to be coming later on, but I know it doesn't deal with it right now, but it is challenges that I know in the riding I represent, the divisional board is looking at trying to get literacy up to national levels, not just Yellowknife. It's going to say this is the literacy rate will be, and we're starting to work on that now. They've done a lot of studies, they've done their homework, and now they're developing a plan to try to address that. Doesn't help now. One of the concerns I have with having a university in the Northwest Territories, who's the university for? First and foremost, it should be for the residents of the Northwest Territories. Yeah, it's great that we're going to get people from down south to come in, but we should be educating our people. The other challenge that I see is that we can't be everything for everybody, so they have to find their niche in this, universal world. And so if it's Indigenous languages, that could be something that we could focus on. But back to your challenge, I just find it a little bit frustrating that we're trying to get people further educated and these barriers are out there. So it'll be something that we'll be looking into a little bit later on. And if you want, we'll follow up with you a bit later on, Crystal, on that.
And also, I can provide the letter that I wrote, because I've also provided for the federal perspective. The Senate Committee for the Arctic was up with the chairperson, Senator David Patterson from Nunavut, and I did provide it for the federal perspective of the federal government giving funds and also their obligation as the Crown to provide education to Indigenous students, and we shouldn't be treated differently because of our geographical location. So I have provided my appeal letter to them as well, just to let you know.
And you're going to share that stuff? Well, okay. We'll make sure we get that to Allison there, and it'll be part of our submissions and stuff like that, if you're comfortable with that, of course. Okay, thank you. Is there any other comments or concerns? Mr. Martin, correct? It's Mr. Martin, right? Mac Martin, okay.
Just for the record, David MacMartin, M-A-C capital M-A-R-T-I-N. Not Mick Martin, that would be a lowlander. I'm a Scottish Highlander, Cameron clan. Just a couple of points, and I'll give you the submission, but I would draw attention to section, part 2, and the quality assurance bodies. We made some very specific recommendations in our submission about that aspect, because as you know, the minister is enabled by the legislation to set up a body of experts to kind of review the quality, do a quality assurance review before an institution is blessed, if you will. But there's the concern we had, and that is addressed in the Ontario legislation, is so who are these people? What kind of body, if it pertains to an Indigenous educational post-secondary institution, what is the requirement of the minister vis-a-vis the appointment of representatives from Indigenous nations, Indigenous educators? We made some specific recommendations about that, and we don't see, again, it goes to that broader point that I made earlier about guidance for the minister. And the Ontario model is worth looking at because it addresses that, and we made some specific suggestions. And there's two options, and the way the legislation is laid out now, it provides opportunity for the minister to delegate to another institution, say in Alberta or Ontario, to do the quality review. And, you know, maybe that is the best thing in a particular circumstance. But there should be some guidance given to provide parameters for the minister in terms of if you're setting up a quality assurance committee vis-a-vis an institution that's addressed in Part 3 or that's being proposed pursuant to Part 3, then there should be Indigenous experts involved in that review. And you know, right now there's no guidance, obviously, because it's pretty blank. But we made some suggestions in that submission that we'll commend to you to consider recommending for amendment to the legislation. And I guess the other thing, just to follow up on Crystal's point, I assume you're related to Carolyn, she's my boss, looking at post-secondary educational institutions in isolation, again, is difficult because from my experience, you know, we've had summer students working, and I had the good fortune of last summer a student who had a degree already, and I noticed the difference. I have three, and I noticed the difference between her writing and the kind of advice and analysis that she would be able to do to provide support for our organization was so much better than someone that didn't have that educational credential. And so building on Crystal's point, you know, maybe there should be more emphasis on that transition. I know the territory is working on it, but I'm not sure that in terms of an post-secondary institution for an Indigenous post-secondary institution, that part of that proposal needs to not just kind of replicate what the territory is doing kind of for citizens and residents as a whole, but there are other issues because the purpose of that institution would be, and it gets back to finding what that niche is. The niche has to, it's not just language and culture and history. So there's kind of an amalgam of different expertise bases that need to be there. And in order to leverage those, there needs to be a certain proficiency in reading, writing, and written expression and verbal expression that, you know, maybe the existing educational system's not providing properly. And it bridges, in my mind, to Treaty 11. One of the issues that I've studied Treaty 11, and we work with it. It's the foundation for our modern treaty. But there's a clause in there that's not part of the modern treaty that is still active, and that clause provides a commitment of the Crown to pay the costs of the teachers of the children. One of the questions that comes to mind is what is a child and which teachers? Because if you have a very gifted student who happens to be Gwich'in, maybe 17 years old, under the age of majority, and goes to a post-secondary institution. So how do we address that treaty right and treaty obligation to pay the cost of the teacher? It's an issue that we have raised and will continue to raise. We don't know the answer, but we feel that it's maybe not by design, but just as history has evolved, that obligation needs to be looked at, and it speaks to the role of the territory in terms of education in the territory, because the territory is a creature of the Government of Canada and is, in our mind, an arm of the Crown, if you will. So there are a lot of dimensions that spin from different aspects of this legislation, some of which we mentioned in our submission. But I just raised the Treaty 11 element because there is an existing commitment made in 1921 to pay those costs. But if you have a gifted student, and there are a number in the Gwich'in Nation, and maybe they haven't been provided with the support that should be coming to them. So I guess I don't know if it's within the purview of the committee to recommend a task force of the legislature to look at some of these issues. We've raised this proposal with the government, and they've agreed to kind of look at, well, what is the role? But maybe there's an oversight role and a directional role that members of the legislature can play to help look across government, across the different portfolios of government, and see how these interrelate, and that could inform your consideration of specific legislation. So appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here. It's actually in addition to part 3, it's that quality assurance part 2 that we had some concerns about, but it raises other questions that I think need to be looked at over time together between the government of the GNWT and the legislative arm and Indigenous nations.
Thank you very much for sharing that information, and that's some good food for thought as we move forward on this bill act later on.
Thanks, Shane. I want to go to your point about the composition of the quality assurance body. It's pretty loose here. It doesn't say whether the people have to have a certain standard of education themselves or what ethnicity they might represent. It just says that there will be this board. And I just want to contrast that to the Corrections Act, which we don't necessarily have to discuss, but the Corrections Act is looking at the possibility of setting up community advisory boards in communities where there are correctional facilities. And what's interesting to me in contrast to this board is that it says specifically that at least 2 members of the advisory board must be Aboriginal peoples of the Northwest Territories. So these are different departments, but the goal of the Corrections Act in part is to bring about reconciliation and healing, and so there is more emphasis in here on those principles, but somehow it got left out of that act. So that's something that we need to grapple with when we write our report on these acts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. We did make specific compositional recommendations addressing that point in our submission, which we'll share with you. And we think that is very important, and that there's different ways, there's different levels of specificity that can be applied in bringing that forward. For instance, we have a group, among the treaty holders, we work together. And so one approach might be to have recommendations be given to the minister from the Indigenous nations working collaboratively, and that the minister may, or you could propose the minister shall accept those recommendations. There are different levels of specificity. Right now there's none, but I appreciate you flagging that, because that's what we recommended. We're kind of curious as to how it kind of got lost in the process, but that's why you're here, to play that oversight role. So it's particularly at the front end of the process where we are now. If you have that guidance and a process suggestion as to how to go about producing the people to populate compositional architecture, if you will, of the advisory body, then the minister's power is exercisable within a framework that the legislation provides, and you know, they could refer to the Correctional Act as that was our recommendations were along that line.
Thank you, Mr. McMartin. You know, just thinking back to our briefings of the minister, I know Caroline, Minister of Education, during our discussions on university in the Northwest Territories, she really felt the need to have partnerships throughout the territory with the Aboriginal groups or Indigenous groups. That's when I recall her saying that, and also building partnerships in the communities. You know, we're looking at how the Yukon is actually doing similar work. They're a little bit ahead of us, but you know, we're looking at, I know she's looking at different ideas. Like we thought we're going to have a university in Yellowknife, which, you know, only made sense, but they feel that it's better to keep the structures we have now, like instead of recreating them. Like, you know, I know in the past we had a successful NRTP program here, and you know, whichever community is specialized in which area or whatever's working, I know that that's what they were looking at doing possibly, but this is the first step to get this in place. But I recall that the minister said that, and but with the elections coming up, you know, everybody has their own way of doing, or their perception of how it's written. But I just want to make that assured. But we'll be sure to put that into when we do our report. That, you know, hopefully we see your submission. But you know, I just recall the minister saying that, and just want to thank you. And you know, good to have all these good questions here. Merci.
Thank you for those comments. We did meet with the minister just more broadly back in, it's about a year ago now, just after the submission was made. Wasn't specifically about that, but on broader issues, of which this was one. And yes, she is open to that, and that's great. But I guess our concern is that the scope of issues around which that partnership can focus will be more narrowly defined if there isn't the more detail in the legislation at this point. So we'll get that to you. I'll get it to you tomorrow morning.
Sorry, I don't know if I can add to just you're talking. Mr. Blake made me think of my past life and the advocacy work that I used to do around barriers to access to services. And I have to say it's a little disheartening to hear that they want to keep the same structure with Aurora College, because that's obviously not a structure that's working for the Northwest Territories. And I would say that they need to think a little bit outside of the box and a little bit more innovatively. But there's always things that are missing. For example, barrier to students going to school is a lot of students live in housing in their communities, and then when they leave their communities, then they leave and lose their home base. And that's a policy, and that's part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Of the first step is having a home over your head and security. And so we're asking students in the north to let go of their security and their roots at home by when they leave their home community, they lose their house. So that's an access. And then we're asking students to only stay in their house during the school year, and they've got families, most students that go back to school in the north, to uproot their families for the summer. And where are they gonna go? Are they gonna be like, and it's a burden not only on them and causes more stress to them as students, it causes also stress on the family that they go and live with because they have no home. They have no home in their home community, and they have no home where they're going to school. And how do you expect our students to be successful if you have those barriers? Simple things that we don't want a society that's dependent on government, but we also want a society that's moving forward and being educated so that they can be equal and meaningful participants in society. So those are things that when you're looking at creating institutions, there needs to be the structural barriers that are broken down. Yes, you need structure and you need a place, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the 3 centers that are currently there that aren't offering degree programs that are only, and then the learning centers where their focus is on upgrading, where that should be gotten at the high school. There shouldn't be a need for upgrading in NWT, in my opinion.
Thank you, Crystal. So I know previously the former housing minister made sure that one of the barriers about housing, that if you were going out for treatment or you were going out to school, you didn't lose your home. And so that was something that was there. I can't tell you if it's still there, but it is, yeah. So, sorry.
You're put on like a priority list, so if there's a house available, then you're first in line. But because we have, especially McPherson and Clavic, we have up to 3-year waiting list, so it's a little more challenging to keep a house open for the whole year while somebody's away. So that's what they've come up with is, and that's what I always mention to students in the fall before they do go, is make sure you go in and say that you want to reserve your home. Like you are going to come back when you're done school, but you just have to let the LHOs know and make those arrangements.
Yeah, and I know from in the riding I represent, they actually were able to come, when they come back from school or from treatment, they were given back the residence. So again, maybe it's just basically what Mr. Blake said, they didn't want to have empty houses, but they also made sure people that were going out still had that priority, and we were encouraging the students and the people that are going out for their addictions to go get help and go get further education, so they could come back and they would have one of their needs still. It wasn't a worry when you're off to school where I'm going to stay when I come back. So they have done that, and depending on the community, the person and the families have been given back their home. So but again, though, it's a whole big picture. It's about, housing. It's also about health and social services, EC&E. It's the holistic approach to education. And when we talk about corrections, it's also looking at that too, right? Transitional housing, aftercare, supports, jobs, so it's a holistic approach to trying to help the individual get better. And so, yeah, thank you very much for your comments. And like I said, it's some good challenges out there that we need to, I shouldn't say good challenges, but some challenges out there that we need to fix. Can
I just say one more thing?
You can say anything you want.
In my previous line of work, we went and looked at the Alaska Native healthcare model and their health consortium and their community health aid program, and where the people are hired in their home community for a job or a vocation, and then they went out for 1 month every couple months, until they earned the certification required to actually do the job that they were in. And so that's what I'm saying, is when we're looking at different ways to educate the people of the North outside of the box, that's things that we need to start looking at, is maybe employing them in their home community in a vocation and then sending them out for 1 month trainings at a time, like where they can earn a degree, or look at different models of training people into vocations.
Thank you. Any further comments from anybody? No. All right. If there's no further comments or presentations from the public, do members agree the agenda item is concluded? Okay, thank you. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. As MLAs, it's a privilege to be here and to hear directly from you. When we make our report in the upcoming sitting of the Legislative Assembly, we will highlight the feedback we received during these meetings and from other public submissions. If you still have questions about the bills or you want to make a written submission, please talk to our committee clerk. You can also visit our website at www.assembly.gov.nt.ca. I will now adjourn this public meeting. Again, thank you very much for attending.